Chapter 10. At night I can still hear the screams, and the smell of burning flesh still lingers in the back of my mind. The next time our cries will be heard throughout the heavens above, and society will have to pay the price along with us. Letter from inmates of the penitentiary of New Mexico. An anthropologist and 11 of his students were called in to search for fragments of human bones in the 6 inches of ashes and rubble that covered the burned out gymnasium's floor. The Office of the Medical Investigator had put into operation its disaster plan, designed to go into effect only when there were 3 or more bodies that cannot be visually identified because the remains are skeletonized, badly decomposed, burned, or mutilated. Never before in the 5 years since its inception had there been a need to put the plan into action. Besides the anthropologist and his 11 students, 6 dentists, the state's chief medical investigator, and many of his pupils worked round the clock, taking as many as 10 hours on each of the 33 autopsies they conducted. A refrigerated truck was parked outside the state laboratory to temporarily store the corpses until the busy pathologists could dissect them. Autopsies usually take no more than 2 hours, but because each body was that of a homicide victim with 2 or 3 assailants, medical investigator Dr. James Weston explained, "I knew that we would need to keep track of lots of evidence. First-degree murder charges will be filed in every one of these cases. All of our findings are going to be presented in court as these cases go to trial." As to the motivation behind the brutal killings, Weston said, "The overriding picture that I got was absolute, unbelievable rage." In the yard where the surviving inmates lived for 3 days after the riot, the rage had not subsided. On Monday, February 4th, 15 convicts had to be taken to St. Vincent Hospital as the result of overnight beatings, stabbings, and one gang rape so severe it left the victim in shock and emotionally scarred for months. Oh boy, didn't have no more fucking grip, man. That's fucked up. They tore his motherfucking spinster up. The paybacks for the non-participation in the uprising had begun. Prison sex continued as usual. God damn. As well, there was fear of the execution squads. Some of those suspected of being part of it had been locked up inside the prison in the relatively undamaged cell house 6, but others still mingled in the yard. The remaining squad members knew that many inmates had been questioned, but they had no way of knowing who had talked about what they had witnessed. Though they were aware that convicts who'd been willing to give names and details were being kept either in the annex or other jails for safekeeping, they knew too many who'd furnished information were still in the yard population. The conditions they were living under out there did nothing to alleviate the turbulence the prisoners felt. They had no shelter except the thin green army blankets supplied by the National Guard, and the first night there weren't enough of them to go around. Another reason for fights and stabbings. "Give me your blanket or I'll pull your throat out." On Monday, when reporters came through to make a tour of the prison, the inmates complained to them that they lacked food and medical attention. "We got the blankets 30 minutes ago to make it look good for the press when they came in," one inmate shouted. "We've been out here 3 days with 1 hot dog," another said. All he had to eat or drink was 1 cup of water since Sunday. On Tuesday, Deputy Warden Robert Montoya let the leash off his own rage. Forgetting that he was surrounded by more than his protective clique, he let the state police who were guarding the prison witness his sadistic streak. 4 inmates who were about to be rehoused in the penitentiary, as units were made accessible, the men were assigned to them, refused to go back, taking up wooden planks to aid their resistance. It wasn't just the memories the building held, they told police. They said they feared for their lives if they went into the prison because they had spoken with state police interviewers. Montoya joined with state police to get the planks away from them, and a skirmish developed in which Montoya was hit on the leg with one of the boards. Finally, however, the convicts were subdued and their arms handcuffed behind them. State policemen flanked each of the men and began escorting them into the building. Deputy Warden Montoya stepped in front of the procession, stopping it, and slapped one of the inmates, Billy Battenfield, in the face twice, screaming at the subject and saying how he would teach him not to hit an officer. State Police Sergeant Billy Holder told Attorney General investigators. Then Montoya ordered the removal of Battenfield's shoes and proceeded to stomp on the handcuffed inmate's stocking-clad feet, saying, according to a prisoner who witnessed it, "Does that hurt? I'm gonna make sure you do the rest of your time in lockup." A former state policeman, Kenneth Thompson, also witnessed Montoya slap and stomp on two convicts. Thompson recalled that someone yelled from inside the prison to knock it off because legislators and American Civil Liberty Union lawyers were on tour. The Attorney General's report on the incident said, Thompson also told investigators that both this incident and another 2 or 3 eyewitnesses involving Bobby Montoya is kind of typical of his attitude toward the prisoners. Montoya denied any wrongdoing though, the Attorney General's report suggests, but does not conclude that he tried to cover up his actions and later withheld information from investigators. These findings weren't released until July 31st, 1980. But when they were, Montoya's reign inside the penitentiary of New Mexico ended. Only inside, however. He wasn't fired from the corrections department, only placed on leave with pay until the position was found where the state could continue to utilize his administrative abilities. By Thursday, February 7th, 496 inmates were housed in the 8 dormitories and 3 cell houses that were habitable. Another 470 were transferred to federal and state prisons across the nation, from Leavenworth, Kansas to Atlanta, Georgia. Those who, like me, had already been granted parole were doing or only waiting time were to be released before the end of February. Life in the penitentiary in those first few weeks after the riot was ugly. Those kept in segregation lockup were so outraged by conditions that they set fires and flooded their cells. The men in one of the cell houses went without water for 15 hours. Because most of the toilets were smashed during the riot, prisoners had to depend on guards to let them out every time they needed to relieve themselves. But the guards didn't let them out. "To hell with you guys, you wrecked the place," one of the state police officers there to supplement the dwindled prison staff heard a guard tell an inmate. Since nature is irresistible, the inmates had no choice but to piss and shit right there on the cell house floor. Only when ex-warden Felix Rodriguez was informed of this did the situation change. He had to order Superintendent of Correctional Security Manuel Coriones to provide the residents with access to toilets. Therefore, state policemen escorted one inmate at a time to the bathroom whenever necessary. Of course, on one count, the guard was right. They had wrecked the place and made it the unsanitary, battle-torn shell it was. Whether they deserved to suffer or not was a moot point, because they did suffer as a consequence of their actions. And meals were only one of the consequences they suffered. Because the kitchen had been demolished, food was prepared at the National Guard Armory 11 miles away in Santa Fe, transported to the institution and served to the men in their cells. The same cells where the floods served as toilets. Naturally, the meals were never hot, nor were they served at regular time. A major frustration when the monotony of the day is broken only by food. Until mid-April, that's all there was to do. Think and eat. Due to security paranoias and the fact that the visiting room had been wrecked, the administration was allowing each inmate to have only one visit weekly with one relative for 5 minutes. Their short dialogue was conducted at the perimeter fence, the inmate standing in the yard while his visitors stood 10 feet away, a moat of land and 2 cross-wire fences between them. Those locked in segregation were allowed no visitors until April. Outdoor exercises were stopped until the spring, and there were no indoor exercises to work off aggression either. The gymnasium had been totally destroyed, nor were there any education programs to occupy their minds. Most of the education department staff resigned after the riot, and the education wing was badly burned. Some correspondence courses were reinstated in mid-March, but they came in with a whimper, with less than 50 inmates participating. All disciplinary reports, grievances, appeals, and good time records had been destroyed. This delayed prisoner classification, which affected participation in the few programs that still existed, as well as living unit status and some parole hearings. Thanks to computers, caseworkers gradually retrieved parole hearing dates and a few other documents, and together with their own notes and memories, compiled new records of each inmate. Those records would no longer be kept inside the prison, but in a trailer outside the main perimeter fence. There wasn't much mail in or out until mid-April, when the mailman became operational. What there was of it was often illegally detoured by correctional officers. Correspondence from attorneys is, by federal court decree, not to be opened by corrections staff except in the presence of the inmate, and only for the purpose of a search for contraband. At least one lawyer had his properly marked letter to an inmate client opened and then returned to him without his client's knowledge. A state police officer observed a corrections guard crumple up and throw away an inmate's outgoing letter. The prison industries program hobbled back to its feet 2 weeks after the riot, but only 11 inmates were involved in it. Damage to the prison industries building and vandalism helped disable the program. According to the Attorney General's report, some of that vandalism was done by non-inmates who stole at least $7,500 worth of prison and inmate-owned material from the hobby shop and prison industries. Guards were the probable culprits. Weapons had been found missing from the penitentiary armory at the base of Tower 1 after the riot: 5 revolvers, a carbine, and a 12-gauge shotgun. The shotgun was recovered from a corrections officer after an internal investigation, and 1 revolver was returned by a former officer as a result of that same investigation. Where the other guns went remained a mystery. It was clear that inmates didn't have them because they never had access to Tower 1 or its keys. If guards did make off with this property, they no doubt felt justified, given the low pay and dangerous working conditions of the job. Just after the uprising, a group of officers staged a work strike to protest those conditions and the trauma their 13 co-workers had gone through while being held hostage. On the day the riot ended, these guards handed their own list of demands to correctional officers. Among these demands were a pay increase to $1,500 per month, additional officers, including a provision that 2 guards be on duty in each tower for all 3 shifts, and 3 weeks of academy training, 1 week of on-the-job training, and 2 weeks of in-service training per month. Though the legislature put through an emergency bill to raise their pay to $1,000 a month, guards were leaving the penitentiary at a record number. 56 quit after the riot, and interviews conducted by the Attorney General show that 80% of the guards employed at the prison 6 months later would resign if offered a better job. They still complained about the cliques, lack of supervision, and the fears of their own safety. The large turnover caused the newly organized Corrections Master Plan Advisory Committee to accelerate the recruitment of correctional officers with a large-scale media campaign, an activity that wasn't as successful as hoped. It only attracted 12 of the 34 people it needed. Because of this continued shortage of personnel, the administration was still hard-pressed to release guards for training sessions. One August class had to be canceled because prison officials couldn't spare the men from their duty. Class teachers took the matter into their own hands. They stood at the penitentiary gates when the guards ended their shifts and asked if any were willing to be trained on their own free time. 25 of them volunteered. The 13 guards who had been held hostage during the riot resigned. 8 of them filed legal suits against the state. In a speech in September 1980, prison psychologist Mark Orner said 3 of these guards were vegetables and psychotic due to the riot, and others were mentally ill. The guards who were raped were, he said, totally destroyed as human beings. The Corrections Department, too, experienced a turnover in personnel. Corrections Secretary Adolph Saines who'd taken the job just 2 days before the riot, was asked to resign by the governor in June after being in the position just 6 months. Some said his ousting was due to the machinations of the corrections clique, but there was equal opinion that he was unqualified for the job and never should have been hired in the first place. There was some merit to this opinion. Saenz had no experience in the field of corrections per se, though he had worked in law enforcement in other countries as an employee of the federal government. Saenz came under fire from prison reform groups after it was learned that from 1965 to 1969, when working as chief U.S. officer of public safety in Uruguay, he played a role as advisor to Uruguay police, at the time criticized by Amnesty International for torturing political prisoners.